Hello everybody, welcome to the Something Interesting channel, where I share my 2 cents worth about the Baha'i teachings, the Baha'i writings, and what Baha'i authors and others have been saying. When we do theology, we are not just sitting at home trying to puzzle out the puzzles. We're talking to others and listening. In the word theology, the ology means dialogue. Feel free to use the comments section to join in. You won't see much of my face because I'm going to record an audio and paste the quotes and other information into the video track. Today, I'm going to look at the words Abdu'l-Baha used for laws and lawmaking in his will and testament. Legislation and the will and testament are important in an argument that Udo Schaefer and others have put forward, that the infallibility of the Universal House of Justice is limited to a few instances in a sphere of action that Udo calls supplementary legislation. For example, he believed that judicial decisions on particular cases are not covered by infallibility. He set out the arguments in Desinformation Methode in 1995. That was translated in Making the Crooked Straight in the year 2000 and published the same year in Baha'i Studies Review, and again in 2002 in Seena, Fazel and John Danesh's collection of papers, Reason and Revelation. The 4 versions are similar. Nicola Taufik and Ulrich Gollmer were co-authors of Desinformation Methode, and no doubt they contributed to that section on the infallibility of the Universal House of Justice, along with Udo's wife Sigrun. Ulrich Gollmer reportedly made a similar argument in his Gottesreich und Weltgestaltung, which we hope to see published one day, Ulrich. Loni Bramson Lurch had previously made a contrary argument, as we shall see, and Udo uses her source research. I am joining in on the tail end of all this. Baha'i Studies is a cumulative self-critical process in the Baha'i community, not a clash of egos or a competition of schools of thought. The publication of Desinformation Methode was welcomed by the Universal House of Justice in its Rizwan message for the year 2000. In that Rizwan message, the House subtly confirmed that its infallibility does not mean that it is always right about everything, by giving the wrong year for the publication of Desinformation. However, the Persian translation of the same argument was not welcomed. The Secretariat at the Baha'i World Centre issued a letter in 2008 which refutes the argument for limited infallibility by not hearing the argument. The letter quotes from the Will and Testament. Whatever they decide is of God. If anyone does not obey the guardian or does not obey the Universal House of Justice, they have not obeyed God, and says that this alone should suffice to dismiss any claims of this kind. But no, it doesn't suffice, because it doesn't answer the reasoning that Udo presented, and because it uses a quote about obedience to refute an argument about the scope of infallibility, and for 2 other reasons. First, that quotation, taken in isolation, gives unlimited power to speak authoritatively to both the guardian and the House of Justice. Yet the guardian's power to speak authoritatively was constrained in 2 ways. He said that he cannot legislate. In the 1944 letter on his behalf to an individual states, "The infallibility of the guardian is confined to matters which are related strictly to the cause and interpretation of the teachings. He is not an infallible authority on other subjects." So why would the words in the Will and Testament, which do not give the guardian unlimited infallibility, be sufficient on their own to dismiss the argument that the infallibility of the Universal House of Justice might be confined to matters which are related strictly to the cause, or even confined to legislation in some broad sense, or confined to hypothetically possible and narrowly defined legislation, which is approximately what Udo has argued. Second, the quotation in isolation does not suffice because the will and testament should be read as a whole and should be read contextually and historically. The will says of the guardian, "He that obeyeth him not hath not obeyed God. To none is given the right to put forth his own opinion or express his particular conviction." This is Shoghi Effendi's translation. Yet Shoghi Effendi wrote, "Let us remember that at the very root of the cause lies the principle of the undoubted right of the individual to self-expression, his freedom to declare his conscience and set forth his views." NSA members and other administrators, he says, should investigate and acquaint themselves with the considered views, the prevailing sentiments, the personal convictions of the community members. Shoghi Effendi's practice shows that he understood the words, "To none is given the right to put forth his own opinion," as having a limited scope. It might mean, "To none is given the right to put forth his own opinion," only in that historical context, when there was a real threat of schism. Or, "To none is given the right to put forth his own opinion," might be understood in the light of the preceding lines about the guardian, to mean, "To none is given the right to put forth his own opinion if it contradicts the guardian." Or it might be compared to the language of the will and testament as a whole and taken as an example of exaggeration for emphasis. Or the principle, "To none is given the right to put forth his own opinion," might be constrained by a higher principle. What we can say is that the words in the will and testament that seems so absolute in isolation should not be read in isolation. And that's a good general rule. Before I say a little about Udo's argument that the infallibility of the Universal House of Justice is limited to supplementary legislation, I want to look at the terms used for law and lawmaking in the will and testament and elsewhere, because Udo did not do this. He assumes a meaning for legislation. He defined it, for example, as the establishment of general abstract norms. But in the will and testament, we find legislation, tashri', which turns out to mean nothing like Udo's definition. We find the codification of law, kanun, which is confusingly translated as ordinances, and does supplement the laws of the Akdas, but not in the way Udo means. And we find regulations, ahkami, which look like supplementary legislation in the Schaeferian sense. If we look at the Akdas, there are more terms. So the category of legislation is a problem. We need to consider what each author means by it in each place. We cannot deduce our own general meaning that meets the needs of our argument and seems logical. Mujin Momin's 2003 presentation on Shoghi Effendi's translation of terms related to law in the Baha'i scripture is a good place to start. He looked at 10 terms. Pause the video to take a good look. Mujin also produced this table of legal terms and their translations in the Akdas. You can see some Arabic terms along the top. Hukm and Kanun are there, but Tashri' is not. Mujin's paper also contains a useful compilation of short extracts containing legal terms in the original languages and in Shoghi Effendi's translations. I think that anyone supporting an argument that the infallibility of the Universal House of Justice is limited to supplementary legislation should read Mujin's paper carefully and reflect on the fact that supplementary legislation does not appear in any of these lists. It has no corresponding term in the source texts in Arabic and Persian, yet it is an important category in Udo's arguments. Udo's argument relies on a narrow definition of legislation. Which of the Persian and Arabic legal terms has he excluded, and why? In his introduction to Baha'i law, Udo says, "The Baha'i divine law is a jus divinum positivum, with the subcategories of jus divinum scripturae and jus divinum supplementum, which together constitute the Baha'i sacred law. I would translate Jus Divinum Supplementum as supplementary God-given law. But supplementary to what, and in what way? Shoghi Effendi refers in English to the establishment of subsidiary ordinances designed to supplement the provisions of the Kitabi Aqdas. But by that he means the ordinances Baha'u'llah revealed in the Ishrakat, Bisharat, Tarazat, Tajaliyat, and other works of the 1870s and 1880s. Supplementary for Shoghi Effendi meant not in the Aqdas. Shoghi Effendi also refers to the Universal House of Justice enacting the legislation necessary to supplement the laws of the Kitabi Aqdas. What house enactments is he thinking of here? Was it the codifications mentioned in the Will and Testament, which are necessary complements to implementing Baha'i law in Baha'i courts? Codification, kanun, plural kavanin, is a type of law that rests on top of the Aqdas, just as an interface rests on back-end coding. Or was it lawmaking on subjects not explicit in the text of the Aqdas? That would be law alongside the Kitabi Aqdas. Or did Shoghi Effendi mean both, the completion of the law to cover more necessary topics and the provision of codifications to support assemblies in implementing the law? And what does Shoghi Effendi consider to be the laws of the Kitabi Aqdas? Does he mean the whole Baha'i Sharia, of which the Aqdas is emblematic? Or is it strictly limited to the Aqdas? Is it hukm and had and ahkam? It cannot be kanun because the Aqdas does not contain a kanun, a codification. It can hardly be usul in the sense of fundamental precepts, because the fundamental precepts of the Baha'i teachings are those revealed by Baha'u'llah, and because Abdu'l-Baha limited the scope of the House of Justice's lawmaking to matters relating to daily transactions. There is no easy answer to the question, what is the Jus Divinum Supplementum in the Baha'i teachings? In fact, if we ask where the Jus Divinum Supplementum is in the Baha'i writings, it is, with the exception of the two texts from Shoghi Effendi that I have mentioned, only implicit, which means it is a matter of understanding. We get in a frightful muddle when we rely on Latin or German or English terms and the categories and rules constructed around those terms, rather than referring to the Persian and Arabic terms. It's time we switched to studying the language of the original texts. Even when dealing with an English text by Shoghi Effendi, there are issues. When the Guardian says that he can never, even temporarily, assume the right of exclusive legislation and cannot legislate except in his capacity as a member of the Universal House of Justice, what exactly is it that the Guardian cannot do? One clue is that he says that he is debarred from laying down independently the constitution that must govern the organised activities of his fellow members. The constitution, along with the bylaws of local and national assemblies, and the codification of Baha'i family law for Baha'i courts, are examples of kanun. Making kanun is one of the tasks of the Universal House of Justice. And I note that none of the kanun we have were formally issued by the Guardian, although he supervised the bylaws and the Cairo codification. So kanun is likely to be one of the things that Shoghi Effendi meant when he said he cannot legislate. Think what this implies for his incomplete project to codify the laws of the Aqdas, to make a kanun, and the word homosexuality that appears in his list of prohibitions. You see, these terms and distinctions could matter, not just in relation to Udo's thesis of limited infallibility, but also to the general way that we read Shoghi Effendi. On page 101 of the Baha'i Studies Review version of Udo's argument, he says, From the very beginning, the House of Justice was envisioned as a legislature and invested with the function of supplementary legislation. I want to distinguish between the role of the Universal House of Justice as the legislative body, as specified in the Will and Testament, and the function of lawmaking. The first terms I will look at in the Will and Testament are in line C of my table. The House of Justice enacts the laws or promulgates the Sharia, and the government enforces them. In beta adl mazdari tashri ast, wa hukumat kovaya tanfidh. As for the word mazdar in the first line, my translation differs from Shoghi Effendi's, where he uses enacts. That has the connotation of a parliament passing bills that become new laws that did not exist before. What it says literally is that this House of Justice is the origin, source, or spring of the Sharia. Those are meanings of Mazdar. Shoghi Effendi sometimes translates Mazdar as wellspring or fountainhead. The water that bubbles up in a spring is not created out of nothing. Rather, it is becoming visible and effective. That is why I prefer promulgates the Sharia. Incidentally, in phrase B of my table, Shoghi Effendi's translation has enacts all ordinances and regulations. But the word there is not Mazdar, but rather Muassis, the founder or strengthener of the ordinances. The dynamic aspect of Mazdari Tashri will become clearer by looking at the two terms Tashri and Tanfidh. These words are a complementary pair. In phrase E of my table, they are called two forces, Do Kove. The House of Justice is the wellspring of Tashri, while the government is the Kove, the power or force of implementation, of Tanfidh. The words say literally, the government or government in general is the executive power. The concept of Sharia, which is part of the word Tashri, is much wider than law and lawmaking in English. The Sharia is a path. It is the pattern for life that God provides. There are at least 4 other places where Abdu'l-Baha writes about the legislature, Tashri, and the executive, Tanfidh, and calls them two forces, and says that they must act together. The first in order of writing is in Abdu'l-Baha's The Secret of Divine Civilization from 1875. In my translation, Abdu'l-Baha says, the guidance of society, moreover, is based upon 2 great and lofty agencies, one which promulgates the religious law and one which is the executive agency. The centre of the executive agency is the government, while wise scholars are the point of reference for the promulgation of religious law. If this firm pillar and mighty foundation is not comprehensive and perfect, how can we expect well-being and success for society? Abdu'l-Baha says that the sphere of training, siyasi, requires 2 forces, the tashri and the tanfidh. The centre of the tanfidh is government, while the centre of the tashri is the ulama, the divines. He's talking about church and state, but then in a Muslim context, where religious scholars are the ones who interpret the details of the Sharia, the religious law. Governments in Islamic countries also make laws, but the word Sharia is reserved for religious law. The second example is in a traveller's narrative of the Bab, probably written late in 1889 or early in 1890, and not in 1886, as E.G. Brown supposes. Abdu'l-Baha refers there to the persecution of the Baha'i community at the orders of Mirza Taqi Khan, known as Amir Kabir. He writes, in my translation, the Prime Minister, acting entirely on his own, without consultation or permission, sent commands to all quarters to chastise and torture the Babis. Magistrates and governors sought a pretext for meddling. Officials sought a means of benefiting from the situation, and celebrated divines from pulpit tops incited mob attacks. The powers of church and state, Tashri and Tanfidh, joined hands to eradicate and exterminate this community. E.G. Brown translates this phrase as the powers of the religious and civil law in A Traveller's Narrative, page 21, which is not a bad translation, but the context shows that Abdu'l-Baha meant to include not only the judiciary, but also the governors and government officials, under the term Tanfidh. The third text is in Abdu'l-Baha's 1892 Risale-i Siyasiyya, or Art of Governance. This fairly short book by Abdu'l-Baha is entirely devoted to describing the two forces. It says that humanity requires guidance and training, siyasi, to develop, and God provides this through two forces, one of which acts through kings and the apparatus of government, the other through prophets, scriptures, and the religious order. Abdu'l-Baha then names the two forces, Tashriya and Tanfidhiya. The first is the explanation and promotion in society of the Sharia. The second is the executive or implementing power in society, and refers to the whole apparatus of government. Government in this sense includes the judiciary, the prison and police, the lawmakers and the bureaucratic apparatus, all of the powers that be in society. In this work, Abdu'l-Baha writes, "If you refer to history, you will find countless examples of this negative sort, all based on the involvement of religious leaders in political matters. These souls are the fountainhead of the interpretation of God's commandments, Tashri, not of implementation, Tanfidh. That is, when the government requests an explanation concerning the requirements of the law of God and the realities of the divine ordinances, they must explain what has been deduced of the commands of God." Clearly, the legislative and executive refer to the relationship between religious and political institutions, the question of church and state, and specifically not to any role for religious leaders in making laws for the state. Further, in The Art of Governance, and more briefly in the Will and Testament, he explains that the relationship between these two is as equal and mutual partners. There is no question of the House of Justice being an arm of government, or the government an arm of the House of Justice. He writes, "The religious law is like the spirit of life. The government is the locus of the force of deliverance. The religious law is the shining sun, and government is the clouds of April. These two bright stars are like twin lights in the heavens of the contingent world. They have cast their rays upon the people of the world. One has illuminated the world of the soul, the other caused the earth to flower. One sowed pearls in the oceans of conscience, while the other made the surface of the earth a garden of paradise. The point is that each of these two signs of grandeur is the aid and assistance of the other, like milk and honey or the twins of Gemini in the sky. Thus, contempt for one is betrayal of the other, and any negligence in obedience to one is sinful rebellion against the other." This tells us what a Tashri-type legislature does in society. It explains what has been deduced of the commands of God and what is in accordance with the law of God, and it does not deal with the improvement of procedures and codes of law, of foreign affairs and domestic policy, which is precisely what a national parliament or legislature does deal with. The partner of Tashri is government, which is the executive power in the sphere of life that consists of laws, regulations, arts, and sciences that benefit humanity and are the result of sound minds and the efforts of the wise and cultured. That is, it is the product of human effort as distinct from revealed law. The fourth text from Abdu'l-Baha shows most clearly that when he refers to an executive force in society, he means the whole of government, not just the executive arm of government in the trias politica of Western terminology. Abdu'l-Baha writes, O concourse of the kingdom of Abha, two calls to success and prosperity are being raised from the heights of the happiness of mankind. The one is the call of civilization, of the progress of the material world. This pertains to the world of phenomena, promotes the principles of material achievement, and is the trainer for the physical accomplishments of mankind. It comprises the laws, regulations, arts, and sciences through which the world of humanity has developed. Laws and regulations which are the outcome of lofty ideals and the result of sound minds, and which have stepped forth into the arena of existence through the efforts of the wise and cultured in past and subsequent ages. The propagator and executive power of this call is just government. And he goes on to say that the other is the soul-stirring call of God, whose spiritual teachings are safeguards of the everlasting glory, the eternal happiness and illumination of the world of humanity, and cause attributes of mercy to be revealed in the human world and the life beyond. This explanation of the two calls has a parallel in Shoghi Effendi's Citadel of the Faith under the heading Two Simultaneous Processes. So now we have 5 examples in the writings of Abdu'l-Baha that consistently talk about the two forces that guide and train society, embodied in the religious order and the political order, using the terms tashri and tanfidh for them, and saying that these two must support one another. In The Secret of Divine Civilization, this is said in reference to Iran in particular, and the terms are explained again in A Traveller's Narrative. In The Art of Governance, it is said in general terms, using proof texts from the Quran, the New Testament, and Baha'u'llah's Epistle to the Son of the Wolf. In the letter quoted above, the two calls are again general in application, while in the Will and Testament this principle is applied specifically to the relationship between the Universal House of Justice and the government. I conclude that what is called the legislative role of the religious leaders and the Universal House of Justice is much wider than simply making laws. Religious leaders are society's legislators in the same sense as poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, as Shelley said. There is another text that should be mentioned, a letter written to an individual believer on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, explaining the sentence in the Will and Testament, "This House of Justice enacts the laws and the government enforces them." The letter says, regarding your questions, by government is meant the executive body, which will enforce the laws when the Baha'i faith has reached the point when it is recognized and accepted entirely by any particular nation. The date of the letter, April 18, 1941, tells us that the secretary must have been Rahir Khanum. In the Will and Testament, the words, "this House of Justice," refer to the International House of Justice, because the sentence before was talking about the guardian's right to expel a member of the Universal House of Justice. But the Secretary's words, "by any particular nation," point to a national government. That shift between international and national levels has been a puzzle for which I think I have the answer. From reading Shoghi Effendi's translation of the Will and Testament, we might think that the government would refer to an international government. I thought so, but this letter sent me back to the original. The Persian text of the Will and Testament says Hukumat, and since Persian has an indefinite article and does not have a definite article, Hukumat is usually translated as the government and not a government or government in general. But it could be government in general. And this is the reading suggested by Rahir Khanum's letter. I think it was English grammar and not his understanding of Abdu'l-Baha's text that led Shoghi Effendi to translate, and the government enforces them. The phrase would read oddly without the, but Rahir Khanum's explanation suggests he was thinking of government at all levels. That is, he means civil government is the power of or force of implementation. Some have supposed that the executive body, which will enforce the laws in this letter, means that the House of Justice is the legislative and the government the executive branch within the three branches of government in a Western political model. But the letter does not say that the government is an executive body enforcing Baha'i law, whether national or international. Rather, government is defined here as whatever body enforces the law, which is close to a classic definition of government as whatever holds the monopoly on legitimate violence. Well, I've been talking for half an hour now, so you might like to pause this and take a break. Maybe I'll split up the video into two, I'm not sure yet. So I'll get back to you later. I'm back. We've been looking at phrases C and D in my table to show that the House being a legislative body means something broader than making laws. Now I will turn to phrase A briefly and then look at the two terms in phrase B, Qanun and Ahkam. In phrase A, I note that the Arabic term khata, translated as error, is a mistake that is made in thought, speech, or action. This contrasts to a fault or shortcoming which one has, an aib. The opposite of khata is sawab, that which is correct. So in the field of knowledge, khata is error and mistake. In the field of action, khata is an omission or failure. From the omission or failure in action, there is the meaning of the wrong that one commits, a transgression. Khata in logic means invalid, not true, mistaken. So it's saying that the universal House of Justice is protected from some or all of these things. That's a topic for another paper, where we could look at other places in the writings where somebody or someone is protected in this sense. This one line is too small a fragment to base a theory on. Regulations, ahkam, and the singular form hukum that are not found in the explicit holy text correspond to what Udo called supplementary legislation, if I have understood him correctly. He thinks it means ordinances and regulations on subjects that are not addressed in the Baha'i writings, and he excludes judicial decisions from his supplementary legislation. Hukum is the word for the ruling of a civil court, and it is used in that sense in the Will and Testament, where Abdu'l-Baha says that if differences arise between countries, the Supreme Tribunal will give the hukme kate, the conclusive judgment. Something similar is found in Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, where the members of an all-inclusive assembly of world leaders are to enforce whatever measures are required to establish unity and proclaim the assembly's edicts. This shows that hukum does not correspond exactly to lawmaking or defining abstract norms. In the Akdas, according to Mujan's analysis, hukum is translated as law, commandment, or ordinance, and it is the primary translation match for law and for ordinance. Ahkam is the word in verse 5 of the Akdas. Think not that we have revealed unto you a mere code of laws. There is no word corresponding to code in the Arabic text. and the word for codified law is kanun, as we will see. I think that Shoghi Effendi has inserted code here simply because English usage requires a counting noun to show the laws are being considered as a collective. He could equally well have said a mere body of laws. But if he had said, think not that we have revealed mere laws, that would be a different statement. In my view, code in Akdas verse 5 is a product of translation into English, and not an indication that hukum and kanun are equivalents. Hukum and the plural are most often used in the writings without naming a specific topic, but I have found it used in the Arkan in relation to the Qibla. The laws of divorce and the Sabbath day that Jesus annulled are hukum. The various laws of daily obligatory prayer in diverse religions are one hukum, although it is clothed in different forms from age to age. Fasting is given as an example of the ahkam in the same passage. It's the one that explains by the terms sun, moon, and stars. Death by stoning in the Pentateuch is the hukum, the prescribed punishment for adultery between a married man and a married woman. The law of jihad that is abolished is a hukum, and likewise Baha'u'llah's command to his followers in Ishkabad not to retaliate. Similarly, we have annulled the rule of the sword refers to hukum as-saif, an observation that resolves the ambiguity of rule in English. It does not mean that the ascendancy of the sword is abolished, but rather the religious rule that believers should use the sword is abolished. In Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, Hukum at-Tafrid is the law of oneness, and Hukum is the Bab's binding injunction that his followers should not let the bayan be a barrier to recognizing Baha'u'llah. A command that I will paraphrase as teach by example is a hukum, in Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, page 29. One broad application of this term is hukum Injil, the law of the gospel, in the Arkan. In Shoghi Effendi's translation, the Christian divines have sought to explain that the law of the gospel, hukum-i-Injil, shall at no time be annulled, and that no independent prophet shall again be made manifest unless he confirms the law of the gospel, Shariat-i-Injil. Shoghi Effendi has translated both hukum and Shariat as law in this sentence, but I think the context requires us to understand this as the gospel message and the Christian way of life. Just to recap, we are looking at hukum and ahkam because in the Will and Testament, the Universal House of Justice is said to enact all ordinances and regulations, kavaneen and ahkami. The question is just how broad is the prescribed domain of the Universal House of Justice, remembering that the answer to this also defines how narrow the prescribed domain of the guardian is. Shoghi Effendi states that the guardian of the faith has been made the interpreter of the word, and the Universal House of Justice has been invested with the function of legislating on matters not expressly revealed in the teachings. Neither can nor will ever infringe upon the sacred and prescribed domain of the other. Because the prescribed domains of the guardian and the Universal House of Justice have this reciprocal relationship, we must aim to get our understanding just right, neither overstating nor understating the scope of the Universal House of Justice. That scope maps onto the scope of the national and local spiritual assemblies. So how we understand hukum and tashri and other terms should affect what we think we are doing as we sit down at the assembly meeting. I have discussed the meaning of kanun and kavanin earlier. I repeat the observation that I made above, that the codification of religious laws in a canon or kanun supplements the laws by bringing together the laws and regulations and advice on a single topic from diverse sources. I've translated the 1932 Cairo codification of Baha'i law on my Baha'i Studies blog. You can see there how a Baha'i Qanun is structured. In the Will and Testament, Qanun seems to mean religious law that is not revealed, but rather produced in response to the needs of the time. This overlaps with Qanun as law in a codified form, since when a House of Justice makes religious law suited to the day, it may well publish it in an ordered form, but not necessarily. The Will and Testament says, "Inasmuch as the House of Justice has the power to enact laws, qawanin, that are not expressly recorded in the book and bear upon daily transactions, mu'amalat, so also it has the power to repeal the same." And skipping a bit, this it can do because it forms no part of the divine explicit text. The House of Justice is both the initiator and abrogator of its own laws. This makes a categorical distinction between revealed law and the Qanun. Revelation is not Qanun, and Qanun is not revelation. Doesn't it follow that every subject is open to Qanun, since simply by being put in the Qanun, it is separated for that purpose from the body of revelation? For example, in shaping the Egyptian codification of Baha'i family law, the National Spiritual Assembly has selected from Baha'i scripture and other sources. Their choice is guided by the conditions in Egypt, and especially by the demands of the civil law for religious communities to codify their family law. The portion of that codification that comes from the Aqdas is still there in the Aqdas, where it functions as revelation. But at another time, conditions having changed, the National Assembly might make a different selection, omitting one Aqdas verse or rephrasing it to meet contemporary legal terminology, and it might add its own regulation or a different Aqdas verse. It has not abrogated the revealed text of the Aqdas, but it has abrogated its own codification that included text from the Aqdas. There will be scriptural elements in any codification of Baha'i law, in any hukm or tashri. So when the Will and Testament says, "The House of Justice has power to enact laws that are not expressly recorded in the book and bear upon daily transactions," it cannot mean that there are subject areas within daily transactions that are off limits as such because they are in the book. It must mean that the laws, qawanin, that it makes do not become part of the book, being of a different class. Here's the Persian text again, from verse 2.9 of the Will and Testament, and Shoghi Effendi's translation with two possible readings inserted. "Inasmuch as the House of Justice has power to enact laws on subjects that are not expressly recorded in the book, so it has power to repeal the same." Or, "Inasmuch as the House of Justice has power to enact laws, which are not then expressly recorded in the book, so it has power to repeal the same." Finally, I will take a quick walk through Udo's argument that the scope of the guardian's infallibility is limited to the sphere of his interpretative power and his role as protector of the faith, while the scope of the infallibility of the Universal House of Justice is limited to supplementary legislation, which is defined so tightly that it has never happened. One of the key texts in his argument is a letter on behalf of the guardian, which in the form Udo quotes it says, "The infallibility of the guardian is confined to matters which are related strictly to the cause and interpretation of the teachings. He is not an infallible authority on other subjects, such as economics, science, etc. The guardian's infallibility covers interpretation of the revealed word and its application. Likewise, any instructions he may issue having to do with the protection of the faith or its well-being must be closely obeyed, as he is infallible in the protection of the faith." This is actually two different letters, which Udo has edited and conflated. As Loney quoted the first letter, addressed to John Ashton, the ellipsis reads, "When he feels that a certain thing is essential for the protection of the cause, even if it is something that affects a person personally, he must be obeyed. But when he gives advice, such as that he gave you in a previous letter about your future, it is not binding. You are free to follow it or not as you please." This is followed by 2 paragraphs on other matters which Loney did not quote. This letter to John Ashton of October 17, 1944, appears to have been written by Rahir Khanum. It was published with Shoghi Effendi's consent in Baha'i News, issue 177, November 1945. Loney states that the second letter is from August 20, 1956. She knows it from a citation by the Universal House of Justice in a letter to Richard Greiser, July 25, 1974. Udo takes from this letter, or 2 letters, an infallibility restricted to authoritative interpretation and the protection of the faith. He omits to mention matters which are related strictly to the cause and the application of the revealed word. That's not fair. If we're going to use this letter on behalf of the Guardian as a guide, and the letters on behalf of the Guardian are a field of study in themselves, we must at least use the whole letter, which says that the Guardian's infallibility covers matters which are related strictly to the cause and the application of the revealed word. Loney comes to a broad conclusion using the same 2 letters on behalf of the Guardian. She says, "Most of Shoghi Effendi's works in interpretation and guidance fall within the limits of his infallibility. Some, though, such as his historical works, fall outside this range, except in his interpretation of the theological significance of historical events." She adds to this 3 examples of historical errors in God Passes By. Udo argues that since the scope of the Guardian's infallibility is limited to one part of the sphere of the Guardian, the scope of the infallibility of the House of Justice must be limited by analogy. I will argue that this argument from analogy is unsound. But even if it were watertight, the scope of the infallibility of the House of Justice would be all matters related to the cause, but not history and economics and the like. That would nicely cover the historical mistake in its Rizwan message that I noted earlier. Then the apologetic purpose of Udo's efforts would not be achieved. Only the saving clause of historical mistakes accepted would be left standing, like the brick chimney where a house once stood. But what about that analogy? In his Baha'i Studies review article, Udo writes, "I think that, analogous to Shoghi Effendi's self-restricting interpretation, the infallibility conferred on the Universal House of Justice does not extend to all its acts, but covers only those functions which are explicitly mentioned in Abdu'l-Baha's testament. These are all acts of supplementary legislation on matters that are not expressly recorded in the book, including the decisions on 1. Problems which have caused difference, 2. Questions that are obscure, and on 3. Issues that are of universal relevance." Notice that he has referred to 3 broadly inclusive categories, the third of which is not in the Will and Testament. He repeats this insertion in his paper Infallible Institutions, page 15. The Will and Testament says, "Problems which have caused difference, questions that are obscure, and matters that are not expressly recorded in the book." Udo must have assumed that his definition of supplementary legislation as establishing general norms is the equivalent of matters not expressly recorded in the book. The bigger problem here is that his word "including" turns all three into subcategories of his supplementary legislation. But in Introduction to Baha'i Law, page 365, he says, there have been only sporadic legislative acts by the Universal House of Justice. Time is not yet ripe for supplementary legislation. In Baha'i Ethics, volume 1, page 131, he says, until now, no supplementary legislation has been passed, and it is not possible to foresee when the time will be ripe for such legislation. In volume 2, he says, the supplementary legislation of the Universal House of Justice has not yet begun in this regard, and the development of a Baha'i jurisprudence, which is a precondition of such legislation, is not even in its earliest infancy. He cannot have it both ways. If questions that are obscure and problems that have caused difference, being mentioned in the Testament, are subcategories of supplementary legislation, then it is not possible to define legislation and supplementary legislation as the establishment of universal abstract legal norms, as he does in Introduction to Baha'i Law and also in Ethics, volume 1. And it is not possible to argue that the infallibility of the House applies only to supplementary legislation, which has not yet begun, in order to postpone the apologetic problem of having infallible religious leadership. Every problem that has caused difference would be covered by infallibility. Later, in his Baha'i Studies review paper, he repeats that the function of resolving problems which have caused differences and questions that are obscure are legislative functions. It claims that the context reveals clearly that this refers not to ad hoc, executive, administrative, or judicial decisions, but to decisions that are of general universal relevance. If this could be maintained, it would restore the limited scope of infallibility. His argument for this in note 129 is, namely, the explicit recourse to the holy text in each case, and the reference to these additional functions as matters which are not expressly recorded in the book, combined with the express statement that all decisions made as part of the sphere of competence have the same effect as the text itself. That argument does not hold water for me. It supposes that the holy text only covers matters of universal relevance, without any ad hoc administrative or judicial decisions. This is inconsistent with his inclusion of the protection of the faith in the sphere of the guardian, covered by the guardian's infallibility. Ad hoc decisions for the protection of the faith are included in our scriptures, in the Will and Testament, and in the writings of Shoghi Effendi. There are many passages in the Baha'i writings that speak to the occasion, which is what ad hoc means, from personal letters to commentaries on world events and the actions of world leaders. If the argument is that there is an analogy between the text and the decisions of the House of Justice that can be called legislative, the conclusion should be that both include ad hoc matters. Moreover, Udo says that the infallibility conferred on the Universal House of Justice does not extend to all its acts, but covers only those functions which are explicitly mentioned in Abdu'l-Baha's testament. But one of the functions mentioned there is tashri', which in Abdu'l-Baha's vocabulary means the broad function of institutional religion in society. Udo has not included this in his list of functions of the House of Justice that are mentioned in the Will and Testament. In this section of his paper, which includes mention of Baha'i courts, Udo struggles to apply the three categories of legislative, executive, and judiciary to the work of the Universal House of Justice. The discussion will be clearer if it is conducted in terms of what the source texts say. Not only are the three functions combined in the one institution, explicitly so in its constitution, The scriptural evidence that these even exist as separate categories of action is scant or non-existent. Shoghi Effendi's plan to have national assemblies recognised as Baha'i courts in certain countries was not the first step towards creating a judicial arm of the Baha'i administrative order. Legislative and legislature in the Will and Testament do not mean what Udo assumed they mean. Where then is the executive? Udo has made a great contribution to Baha'i studies. On the topic of infallibility, Udo shares the laurels with others I have mentioned. Some of them worked closely with Udo. As we gather in a symposium in recognition of Udo's contribution, I would like to mention also Peter Schaefer, who died on September 7, 2014. Peter had a vigorously inquiring mind as regards Baha'i teachings and other topics, and supported the publications of Udo and myself, and probably others. He was also a most hospitable host. Our gratitude to him is also our acknowledgement that Baha'i Studies is an evolving collective effort, and it's not just the named authors who contribute. I have not been thorough in my treatment of the legal terminology of the Will and Testament, but between my work and Mujan's, enough has been said to show that further studies of Baha'i law should take into account the diverse terms and diverse types of law. I think I've also shown that the approach to infallibility, that is, to conferred infallibility, better translated as infallibility as an attribute, that Udo polished in these 4 publications cannot be taken further. It has problems of terminology, weakness in logic, and when these are taken into account, it cannot achieve its apologetic purpose. I believe that Baha'i theology on the topic of infallibility should make a turn from looking at the scope of the infallibility of the guardian and the House of Justice to understanding the meaning of infallibility, beginning with a close examination of the Arabic and Persian texts. Udo did not do this, so far as I am aware, and I have not done it here, but I would like to make 2 quick observations. First, the requirement in the Will and Testament that the hands must assent to the guardian's choice of a successor is an indication of how Abdu'l-Baha thought of the guardian's divine guidance. It appears Abdu'l-Baha relies on the process to produce the correct result, rather than every step in the process. If Abdu'l-Baha thought that the guardian's guidance would be enough to ensure that his choice would be the right person at the right time, confirmation would be unnecessary. The guardian's choice of a successor appears to me to be a matter of the protection of the community, and also to be covered by Abdu'l-Baha's justification for infallibility as an attribute in chapter 45 of Some Answer Questions. In my translation, that section says, for example, many of the holy souls were not dawning points of the most great infallibility, but under the shadow of the divine protection and patronage, they were yet kept and preserved from sin, because they were the mediators of grace between God and men. If God did not protect them from sin, their sin would cause all believers to fall into error, and in total the foundation of the religion of God would be broken. This would not be fitting or worthy of the Lord of unity. In short, infallibility of the essence is limited to the universal manifestations, and infallibility as an attribute is the gift of every holy soul. My second observation is that if infallibility means he can do no wrong, rather than he will never be wrong, then infallibility is linked to obedience. For example, we are obedient to government, but if a government requires us to do what is morally wrong, we have a dilemma. We must decide whether the wrong is so fundamental and irreparable that it violates our conscience and we must disobey. This also applies to a local or national spiritual assembly. If they ask of us what we conscientiously believe to be both morally wrong and irreparable, we must disobey. In the case of the Guardian and the House of Justice, their infallibility means that we cannot face that dilemma. They do no wrong. However, if we merely think that a government, an assembly, or the Universal House of Justice may be wrong about something, without that moral dimension, because they had wrong information or reasoned wrongly, we know we may be wrong ourselves about that thing. For example, we might have incomplete information. So we have no moral dilemma, no argument for disobedience. It is only where we think a government or assembly are doing wrong that we may be obliged to disobey. The moral infallibility of the Universal House of Justice, if we accept this definition, means that we have to surrender our judgmental conscience as regards their actions. We can wag no finger at them. This does not apply to our assessments of the national or local spiritual assembly or governments. The rule there is not to view with too critical an eye the sayings and writings of men, but also, as the proverb says, one who walks wisely shall be delivered. Well, I hope you found that was something interesting.